warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Dear friends, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this. It's going to be very interesting discussion. But I also would like to congratulate the apa namanya? Orangnya lucu loh. FMIA, waduh, FMIA kayak ini, FMIA. But I wanted to congratulate FMIA for the discussion and the activities that have been carried out during its establishment. And I like to also say that, of course, Consular General will be always ready collaborating with FMIA in their activities. Now, on this issue, I know it's a very interesting, but at the same time, it's a heavy issue. And I'm really happy to see our colleagues, Pak Fedi Hafiz, Gus Nadir, who is my spiritual mentor, and of course, Pak Grace Burton, whom I known for quite some time. So thank you so much for your presentations later on. But let me just say a few words. I think 1 month ago, I was attending Asia Link dinner in which former Prime Minister Howard said in around 200 or 300 attendants at the time that what happens in Indonesia gives a bit nervousness to the Australian. And by saying that, actually what we are trying to beef up this confidence by the business people, it's a bit, well, I understand they get nervous. I think Pak Anton mentioned when you had a discussion also with Pak Mahendra. When Pak Mahendra came here, I think 2 weeks ago, he said what happened in Indonesia, if you see that as an episode only, nothing to be worried about, because previously there are many experiences that much worse. And Indonesia is confident, and Indonesia is determined to maintain this this diversity and unity. So at the same time, I think 2 days ago, former Prime Minister Howard said in the 60th year of Asia Society, Pak Greg, he mentions Indonesia is the third functioning democracy in the world. I don't know why he means functioning. I don't know which one is still, perhaps, is United States still functioning, or I don't know. Oh my God, I'm not supposed to say that, but anyway, this is intellectual exercise. Now I'm serious. So as the highest representative of government in Melbourne, I welcome very much these intellectual discussions. I hope that with Anton said that what happens in Indonesia, and former Prime Minister what said gives nervousness. Some intellectuals said, it's kemunduran of democracy in Indonesia. I hope this discussion will give a further understanding. And if you put it, democratization, radicalisation is Islamophobia. And at the end of the discussion, I was really I hope that this discussion can enhance our understanding, enhance our appreciations to diversity, to the difference of what we have among the Indonesian people, and of course this is the objective of the government, so that we can enhance the unity. Whatever happens that's going to threaten that unity, we together we can face that. So with that, I really hope that this is going to be frank discussion, But at the same time, I hope this can be shared to other community, Indonesian community, so they are aware that this is the discussion that we are having. I don't know whether this representative of IMCV, is it here? IMCV?
We already invite them.
You invited them?
Yeah, we invite everyone here.
Yeah, I think we need to also inform IMCV because that is the organization of a Muslim community in Victoria. So I hope somewhere along the line next time around we'll make sure that you know. But in any way, thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for the panelists. I look forward to listening to the presentation of the panelists, and hopefully if you can give also recommendations of how to strengthen our community here, I think that would be very appreciated. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Coming to yet another event where I'm going to talk. In which you might get bored again. So Islamic radicalism and Islamophobia, two keywords. You switch on the telly, you open the internet and all that. These two keywords tend to come up when you're looking at the news, right? Now, I think the first thing you've got to do is, right, you understand that these are problems. These are contemporary problems. Whether in the established Western democracies or in sort of developing Muslim majority societies like Indonesia. So they're global issues. And I suppose from our point of view, before we talk about preventing, before we talk about addressing, before we talk about responding to these problems, we actually need to know why there are problems in the first place. Why have they emerged, and why have they emerged now? And I think that there's been a lot of discussion about these sorts of things. Some of them that agree with each other, some of them that are mutually contradictory. I suppose in this sort of few minutes that I have, because it would be talking to be quick, I'll put forward, three propositions. All right. First of all, that Islamic radicalism, although of course it is driven by ideas, although it is connected with people who have a strong attachment to a particular set of ideas, or at least interpretation of a particular set of ideas, is actually related to things much more profane and material. It's not just about religion, it's not just about theology, it's not just about bringing some sort of idealized understanding of what a Muslim society should look like on earth. All right? Of course, that's in the heads of a lot of people are involved. But the issue is why there are many people who look at what are really material and profane problems in the world today through Islamic lenses that are colored by radical or highly conservative, let's say, interpretations of Islamic doctrine. Okay. Now, I wouldn't be the first person to say this, but I say this rather strongly. I believe that there is a context to understand, and the context is usually having to do with the fact that Islam provides, or at least conservative, radical interpretations of Islam provide a lens, a framework through which people who feel themselves to be disenfranchised, dispossessed, marginalized, really about the decline of the welfare state. It's about the decline of social democracy. It's about the rise of social inequalities with, the neoliberal transformations that have been felt all over the college, university in Australia. And maybe after a few years you can buy a house. Can't do that anymore in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's a sense of, there's something unjust going here, right? And so again, the reaction really is that of distrust of the entire social order, of the institutions of politics and governance, the parties, the parliaments, and so on, right? So, but let's say, the sort of Islamic organizations that tend to be on the fringes of society and the state. Well, now, because of recent developments in Indonesia, you see that some of them have got closer to the center of.
Vinny and I will outline things and confuse you as political scientists, and then Radhika as a spiritual leader will answer the problem. So we're just building up to Nabi's explanation. But then he made a number of important points that I'll try and build on and unpack. One is, of course, the question of what we mean by radicalisation. And I think it's true that these things are hard, these terms are hard to nail down, but let's try and be specific. So increasingly there is talk not just about counter-terrorism, but countering violent extremism. And implicit in that are two ideas. One is that if we just wait for the police to respond to a bomb call or something like that, then probably it's too late, we should be doing more beforehand. And the police themselves say that actually we need to work together as a society because they would rather not be arresting people, particularly young people. Now Islamic State is radicalising very young people. They'd rather not be arresting teenagers. They'd rather the problem is dealt with earlier. And so this suggests a more holistic approach. But it's interesting the term violent extremism is used rather than terrorism. And that term violent is very specific. What is being implied is the problem is not that people have strong ideas. So it's not that people have extremist ideas. I mean, if, for example, one of us decides that the planet would be better off if we were vegetarian, or maybe even better if we were vegan, that would be a strong idea. And in a sense, it's radical. Radical because radical means the idea of the word radical is to go back to the root, the radix of the problem. So it's to sort of have a root and branch change. So when friends of mine tell me that they're vegans and that it's better for the planet, I admire them and I agree with them. Then I go back to eating my dinner. I'd like to be able to do it myself. I mean, to give up meat. I think it would be a good thing. I haven't got to that point yet. I blame it on nasi padang and other things. Still, it's a good idea in principle. The point of this illustration is that just because somebody has a strong idea and a radical idea doesn't mean it's a bad thing. The problem is when it involves violence. But lately there's been an awareness that, okay, violence is a problem. Clearly if somebody becomes a terrorist, blows up innocent people, attacks people, runs them over with a car, that's a problem. We can see that. But there are also kinds of extremism that aren't necessarily directly violent, but already present a problem. So if you think of last December in Jakarta, particularly 2nd of December, and more than 500,000 people, maybe 750,000 people in Jakarta, protesting about many things, to be fair. Not everyone had the same view. There's many different points of view. But there's a concern with what happened with Pilkada that there are some elements, some political elites, who are using popular sentiments for purposes of their own political interests. And there's two concerns there. One is that it can corrupt democracy, and secondly is that it can incite hatred. So when thinking about this problem of where to draw the line with extremism, I think incitement of hatred is a point where we should begin to be concerned. So I agree that somebody's absolutely entitled to argue that the moon is made out of cheese. Crazy idea, but if they want to believe that, that's fine. There are still some people who believe the world is flat. And there are other ideas that are less uncommon, that people hold to very strongly. Some people believe that climate change is all a hoax, they don't accept it. I mean, people have lots of different views. And that's not a problem in itself. At the moment in Australia, there's, as you know, a postal vote, a plebiscite about same-sex marriage. And there's concern that the debate that goes with that becomes very heated. It's not that having different views is the problem, it's the way people express their views. And there's a very specific concern to young people who might be experiencing pressure and and that can drive them into a situation where their mental health is endangered and they become depressed or suicidal. Those issues are very real. So the difference of views and convictions is not the thing, it's a question of how we express them. Now, this is not just about religion, but clearly it applies to religion as well. Somebody can, for example, describe themselves as being Salafist, and have a very strong view about things. Between NU and Muhammadiyah, there's a difference of opinion about lots of things, but mostly about whether you speak to dead people and visit them. NU is completely normal to speak to dead people. For Muhammadiyah, that's regarded as very creepy and strange. It's a little bit like the distinction between Orthodox and Catholic forms of Christianity and Protestant Christianity. So there's differences of opinion. But somebody could be Salafi and having a very strong approach to their personal life, and yet be a very good neighbour, very good citizen, making a very positive contribution, and definitely not inciting hatred. I mean, definitely sort of being respectful of everyone. So the issue is not the religious belief, it's a question of what happens with it. The reason we're talking about radicalisation at the moment is specifically a concern about terrorism, and that sort of violent extremism, and particularly Islamic State. This last 3-4 years, as ISIS has emerged, that's become a real concern. And it's true, everything that he said is true about social factors, but one of the challenges in Australia, one of the really difficult things to understand, is why the rates of people who have tried to go to Syria, Iraq, or have gone, or are supporting those who are going, mainly for Islamic State, why those rates are similar in Australia in terms of the target population that Islamic State is targeting, which is mostly they're looking for second generation kids from Muslim households who don't know much about religion. That's generally what they look for. So in Australia there's a Muslim population of around 600,000. In the UK it's about 3.5 million. In the UK around 800 to 1,000 people have gone to Iraq, Syria. In Australia it's about 250 or thereabouts. Not everyone went to join ISIS, some went to join Jabal al-Nusra, some went to join other groups to do humanitarian work. But it's interesting, there's a report today saying Gil Kirchhoff, who's head of EU, head of counterterrorism, is saying that looking across the EU, they're worried about 50,000 plus violent extremists who concern them. And he said in the UK alone it could be 20 to 35,000 people. The actual number of people that MI5, the domestic intelligence agency, is looking at is much smaller, it's about 3,000. But remember, after the Manchester bombing, people said, why did the police not see what was happening in Manchester with the Libyan community? Well, it's because the numbers are so large, they just get lost in the numbers. We can talk about the UK, the problem is even more serious in some ways in Belgium and in many ways in France. And you say, well, there's youth unemployment, there's lots of racism. But in Melbourne or Sydney, the problems are not as extreme. But the mystery is why the ratio of recruitment and radicalisation is similar. And it seems to me the only inference we can draw is that this is about pull factors and not just push factors. And you might say, well, it's all about this online propaganda. You can read Dabiq magazine or Emir magazine or watch the online videos, very well done. It's very convincing stuff. But actually, just watching a YouTube clip in your bedroom is not going to radicalise you. Radicalisation is a social process. It's when somebody approaches you and says, we really like you, you're a smart guy or a smart girl, you ask the right questions, let's come and talk about it. And they, week after week after week, sometimes it's online, sometimes it's face-to-face, sometimes it's both, they build up a friendship. And sometimes it takes on an aspect of grooming, but it's always a kind of friendship. It's maybe sometimes a genuine friendship, often it's a very false friendship, but it's a social process. And if you look at the accounts of Australians or Indonesians who have been recruited, it is that recruitment process. It's not just that they passively self-radicalise. That almost never happens. So that probably explains why the problem in Australia is as large as it is, because Australian youth are very globalised, they travel a lot, they're very much online, and so they're soaking up information from the other side of the world, even though the problems in their own suburb or their own city or their own household aren't that serious. It's not so much push factors. But as Betty was saying, the social context is very, very important. It's interesting that in the US, you can find different numbers, but basically there's a fairly clear picture that the number of terrorist incidents since 9/11 carried out by right-wing extremists is greater than the number, quite considerably greater than the number carried out by radical Islamic or jihadi extremists. The jihadi attacks tend to have a higher death toll, and so the number of victims is roughly comparable. Although up until the Orlando, Florida attack, the right-wing extremist attacks have claimed more lives since 9/11 than the jihadi Islamist attacks. And that tells us something very interesting. It means that there's another kind of problem going on at what we think is the opposite end of the spectrum. You think of whatever you explain with Islamic State and jihadi extremism, it's different than right-wing extremism. But when you look at the life stories of young people in particular, but people who get drawn to these groups, there's similar kinds of factors going on. It's about wanting to belong, wanting to have a purpose, wanting to be part of a group, whether it's joining an actual terrorist group attempting to carry out a terror attack, or whether it's just joining a protest, and like we saw in Charlottesville, for example, and that can be very ugly, but not necessarily violent. And you ask people why they join, it's all about belonging, being part of a group. So that social phenomenon is very important. Ironically, of course, every time there is a jihadi terror attack, we see from where there are surveys being done in the UK or the US or even Australia, there's a spike in anti-Muslim sentiment, which brings us to the term Islamophobia. I don't suppose any really likes being stuck in very confined, tight spaces. If I said to you, I'm going to put you in a box the size of a coffin and leave you there for 12 hours, and then I'll come and get you out in the morning, I don't think you would think it was a very good idea, right? It's normal not to be liked to be, it's quite normal that you don't like being stuck in tight spaces. But claustrophobia is something different than not liking being stuck in a tight space. Claustrophobia is when your anxiety and fear about being in a confined space is so extreme that it means you find it hard to get on a bus or a train or take an airline flight, because you just become paralysed with fear and you need help to overcome that fear. So it's an irrational fear. And I think there is a place for using the term Islamophobia of people who express very strong negative views towards Islam and Muslims, to the extent that it becomes an irrational level of fear. If somebody says, I'm worried about terrorism, I saw this video of an ISIS attack, an Al-Qaeda attack, and that scares me, that's a natural response. No one likes that. Muslim, non-Muslim, and most of the victims of groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, of course, are Muslims, mostly Sunni Muslims, in fact, even though they're very, Islamic State's very big on focusing on Shia Muslims, saying they're the enemy, but actually it's the ordinary Sunni folk of Iraq and Syria who are suffering. So it's normal to be a bit anxious about that. But I think when somebody has an absolutely irrational view, put it this way, somebody has a fear of Islam and Muslims which is out of all proportion to any active, understanding or real data, then describing it as a kind of phobia, I think is reasonable. Like phobias, they can be overcome. You recognise this is doesn't make sense. It's irrational fear. I should overcome it. But there is a phenomenon, as Vinny was saying, where we have a kind of a co-radicalisation going on. We have an attack. We saw tragically in the UK this year, attack on Westminster Bridge, attack in Manchester, attack in London Bridge, the Borough Market, and then a man in Wales goes and hires a white van, drives 3.5 hours from Wales to Finsbury Park and runs down Muslim worshippers leading a late night prayer session. That guy was a right-wing extremist. I think he was a terrorist, the same as the murder of Joe Cox. Last year was a terrorist, because there's a consistent body of political understanding that goes with their motivation. It's not just irrational hatred, it's actually a considered position. And the action was Islamophobic. But it doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a very strong correlation between the spiking of these sort of incidents.
Bukan yang saya muliakan dan saya cintai. Susah untuk bicara bahasa Inggris karena tadi Pak Drik bahasa Inggris sudah bagus sekali, dari salah. Bahasa Arab. Ya, saya coba lanjutkan apa yang tadi sudah didiskusikan oleh kedua senior saya ini. Saya ngomong bahasa Indonesia selain karena tadi bahasa Inggrisnya Pak Drik jauh lebih bagus, saya minder jadinya. Yang kedua, saya baru retweet di Twitter, jadi 60.000 follower saya ikut menyaksikan live sekarang. Dan follower saya itu kebanyakan santri-santri NU. Jadi kalau saya ngomong bahasa itu mereka nggak paham nanti. Ya, saya kira ada dua hal mengikuti dari Bang Fedi tadi, ada masalah internal dan masalah eksternal. Dari masalah internal, apa yang disampaikan Greg Barton tadi saya kira pas sekali, bahwa ini ada problem interpretasi, pertarungan interpretasi di dalam tubuh umat Islam sendiri. Dan ini bukan hal yang baru, ini sudah sejak lama. Zaman Nabi Muhammad saja, Nabi Muhammad sudah memperkirakan bahwa akan ada nanti satu kelompok yang dia alimnya itu mempesona kalian. Kalian kalau ketemu itu merasa kurang islami, karena bacaan Qurannya lebih fasih, ibadah malamnya lebih banyak. Tapi mereka itu seperti anak panah yang lepas dari busurnya. Artinya mereka itu sebetulnya tidak merepresentasikan Islam, bahkan berbahaya buat kelangsungan Islam. Ini dikenal dalam sejarah Islam golongan Khawarij. Nah, salah satu tips yang kita di kalangan Nahdlatul Ulama coba lakukan adalah ketimbang mengatakan bahwa mereka itu kelompok teroris, dan sebagian besar malah bangga kalau kita lihat bukunya Imam Samudra kan, bahwa justru saya teroris dan saya melawan the real teroris kan gitu, Amerika maksudnya. Jadi kami lebih senang menyebut mereka adalah kelompok Khawarij. Karena kalau disebut kelompok Khawarij, mereka jadi sensi kan gitu. Karena tahu bahwa ini ada kaitannya dengan sejarah Nabi Muhammad tadi. Nah, salah satu ciri dari kelompok Khawarij ini adalah mereka merasa mereka paling benar Islamnya. Di luar mereka kafir, ini gerakan takfiri. Jadi kita gampang melihat bahwa orang-orang seperti inilah yang kemudian mudah sekali diprovokasi lewat para ustadz yang kemudian akhirnya menjadi sangat keras. Jadi gerakan radikalisme ini yang awalnya tidak kekerasan, ujungnya bisa menjadi kekerasan kalau kemudian ini diprovokasi dengan mudah, dan gampang sekali itu mempermainkan emosi. Kalau sudah bicara agama gitu kan, biarpun tidak pernah ke gereja setiap minggu atau tidak pernah sholat Jumat setiap hari Jumat ke masjid, tapi kalau sudah agamanya di kotak-katik kan akhirnya menjadi sangat emosi. 7 juta di Monas kumpul kan begitu. Tapi juga ada faktor eksternal selain ada faktor pertarungan internal itu tadi. Kalau faktor eksternalnya adalah seperti disebut oleh Bang Ferry tadi soal ketidakadilan di dunia. Saya ingat karena sama-sama Bang Ferry dulu di Singapura, itu Goh Chok Tong ya, bekas Perdana Menteri Singapura. Itu mengatakan bahwa kemanapun saya pergi, ketemu dengan para pemimpin Islam, apakah itu presiden, apa itu prime minister atau menteri atau apapun, atau para ulama, semuanya, no matter how they articulate it, semua ada kegeraman terhadap persoalan Israel dan Palestina. Ini persoalan ketidakadilan yang luar biasa. Minggu lalu misalnya, seorang kiai yang sangat dihormati di Nahdlatul Ulama, Mustafa Bisri, kita panggil Gusmus, itu sampai menyelenggarakan malam puisi untuk Palestina. Tentu beliau seorang budayawan, jadi tidak mungkin teriak-teriak bunuh-bunuh, tidak mungkin lakukan hal ini. Tapi beliau mengumpulkan para penyair untuk membaca puisi-puisi dari orang Palestina yang menceritakan betapa sengsaranya mereka, betapa mereka terusir dari negerinya sendiri. Dan ini menjadi problem besar. Kenapa? Karena kalau ini persoalan global dan ini menjadi beyond dari saya bisa berdebat di kalangan internal seperti kata Pak Agri tadi. Tapi kalau sudah bicara dunia global, ya aku mah apa atuh kan gitu kan. Jadi saya nggak bakal bisa buat apa-apa. Nah, sehingga apapun yang saya lakukan di internal, saya berdiskusi, saya katakan bahwa tidak betul itu ada konspirasi Barat dan Islam, dan Yahudi menyerang Islam. Kita harus berbuat baik dong pada non-Muslim. Tahu-tahu kemudian ada berita orang Muslim tidak bisa masuk Masjid Al-Aqsa di Israel. Ini cepat sekali beritanya. Jadi semua argumentasi saya mengutip kitab tafsir klasik, saya mengutip pendapat ulama moderat, kiai pesantren, hancur semua. Hanya dengan mereka melihat, loh nanti kata kamu mereka baik. Ternyata tidak kok. Kata kamu mereka tidak menyerang Islam. Loh ini buktinya. Ya berapa banyak, mau masuk masjid aja nggak boleh, berapa banyak di Gaza yang disingkirkan apa. Jadi semua argumentasi saya selaku Muslim scholar itu jatuh berkeping-keping di depan mereka. Nah, ini jadi persoalan akhirnya kan. Sementara internalnya kita berjuang, berdebat, tapi eksternalnya nggak pernah dibenerin. Saya kasih contoh misalnya Australia saja, karena kita tinggal di negeri yang indah ini. Setiap urusan dengan Israel pasti membela Israel. Misalnya, ini Bu Barbar, setiap ada urusan dengan Israel pasti membela Israel. Pemerintah Australia. Ini sudah menjadi kebijakan foreign policy di sini. Meskipun misalnya para pakar hukum internasional yang juga punya darah Yahudi, Profesor Ben Saul misalnya dari Sydney University, berulang kali menulis di koran, berulang kali mengecam posisi pemerintah Australia bahwa tidak bisa secara hukum internasional apapun dilakukan Israel itu dibenarkan karena juga banyak problemnya. Tapi selalu pemerintah Australia membela Israel. Dan ini kesannya seperti tadi saya bilang, seluruh argumentasi saya berantakan semua. Gitu. Akhirnya, loh, mereka jelas-jelas berpihak ke sebelah sana kok, gitu kan. Kok tiba-tiba mau dibaik-baikin, tiba-tiba kita mau bilang nggak ada masalah, nah apa. Nah, karena itu antara hubungan eksternal dan internal sangat kuat. Ya, oke, itu buat topik diskusi berikutnya bisa kita bahas lebih jauh. Yang kedua yang saya mau omongin sekarang soal Indonesia. Nah, menyambung dari Bu Konjen tadi, betapa sekarang kesannya di luar Indonesia mundur demokrasinya gara-gara kasus pilkada DKI. Sekarang pilihannya adalah kita mau main belak-belakan, kita mau ngomong jujur belak-belakan, atau kita mau ngomong diplomasi, gitu ya. Karena kemarin misalnya kolega saya Yeni Wahid, ketika wakil presiden Amerika datang, dia katakan, oh Indonesia baik-baik aja kok, nggak ada masalah. Di belakang dikecam habis oleh kalangan NU sendiri. Kenapa ngomong begitu? Terus kata Yedi, ya saya kan harus diplomasi dong bicara. Masa bagaimanapun ini negeri kita. Tidak mungkin dong kita bicara yang jelek-jelek semua, apalagi soal wakil presiden Amerika datang. Kita harus tenangkan, ademkan bahwa nggak usah khawatir gini. Karena itu sekarang pilihannya dua. Saya mau ngomong belak-belakan atau saya mau ngomong bermanis-manis. Nah, kalau bermanis-manis kan Bu Konjen, kan gitu kan. Yang kebetulan memang manis gitu.
Manis kok ya.
Kalau mau berpanjang paspor nanti.
Nah, jadi kalau kita mau bicara belak-belakan, saya melihat bahwa sejak masa Orde Baru sebetulnya dan terus sampai masa sekarang, cara pemerintah menangani kelompok radikal itu adalah dengan cara menganggap ini persoalan politik saja. Karena persoalan politik, maka yang dilakukan adalah selalu kompromi. Bagaimana merangkul mereka. Jadi, karena ini persoalan politik, merangkul dan kadang-kadang bisa dimanfaatkan juga. Gitu. Jadi kalau misalnya dulu itu ada preman pemuda Pancasila ya, Bang Fedi ya, itu yang dipakai oleh Orde Baru. Gitu. Kalau ada persoalan pemuda Pancasila. Setelah Orde Baru selesai, ada reformasi kan, yang dipakai preman berjubah kan gitu. Nah, jadi kalau ada apa-apa nanti FPI yang turun apa. Dan kita tahu siapa yang menciptakan FPI, mengkreasinya segala macam. Nah, dan yang dilakukan selalu politiknya adalah kompromi. Misalnya di bawah itu teman-teman gerakan pemuda Ansor dengan bahasanya sudah teriak NKRI harga mati gitu ya. Tidak ada kompromi kalau sudah bicara ideologi. Tapi ternyata kemudian Presiden Jokowi misalnya menerima di Istana Negara teman-teman dari GNPF, MUI misalnya. Ya, terus. Atau misalnya kemarin teriak-teriak soal Habib Rizik Syihab, tersangka yang kemudian kasus asusila melarikan diri, tidak kembali, tidak pulang, dan semua polisi kesannya kan galak bener, sudah sampai taruh di mana, di Interpol, gagal di apa. Tapi belakangan kita dengar apa? Polisinya nyamper itu ke sana misalnya. Gitu. Dan itu membuat kalangan Nahdlatul Ulama termasuk saya menjadi sangat marah. Katakan bahwa kalau gitu silahkan aja pemerintah bertarung sama mereka. Nggak usah melibatkan kami, Nahdlatul Ulama, nggak usah melabelkan bangsa. Buat apa kami disuruh bertarung untuk mengatakan NKRI harga mati seterusnya? Tapi pemerintah sendiri menganggap ini sebuah pertarungan politik saja menuju 2019. Jadi selama bisa dimanfaatkan, selama bisa diamankan, kenapa tidak kita rangkul aja? Gitu. Nah, sementara buat teman-teman di kalangan pesantren, ini bukan masalah politik, ini masalah pertarungan ideologi. Ini masalah kelangsungan NKRI. Apa mau Indonesia menjadi Syria? Apa mau Indonesia kemudian menjadi hancur lebur dan memori kita tentang indahnya Indonesia nggak bisa lagi kita ciptakan pada anak cucu kita. Jadi ini membesarkan, merangkul yang semakin lama semakin besar. kritik saya kepada yang coba merangkul itu adalah sudah 19 tahun loh merangkul FPI. Apakah semakin mengecil? Apakah FPI semakin melunak atau semakin membesar dan semakin menguat? Nah itu persoalannya. Nah karena itu posisi saya sangat tegas dan sangat keras kalau udah urusan sama NKRI. Dan akibatnya misalnya jangan kita bicara di Indonesia gerakan radikal gerak. Kalau di Melbourne aja jadi persoalan kok. With all due respect, misalnya 3 masjid Indonesia di Melbourne di sini memboikot saya misalnya. Jadi meskipun tadi Bu Konjen misalnya mengatakan bahwa saya spiritual leadernya, misalnya Bu Konjen sendiri secara pribadi kalau ada masalah agama tanya ke saya. Tapi apa konsulat jenderal pernah ngundang saya berceramah di Konjen misalnya?
Paspor dibatasi.
Oh iya. Misalnya apa namanya? Buat tadi kan kita disuruh melawan orang-orang. Idul Fitri, Idul Adha saja nggak pernah kok saya diminta untuk hidup khutbah. Nah maksud saya
Waktu itu diundang tapi kan pergi ke Malaysia.
Saya takutnya.
oh iya sudah kembali kan tidak diundang lagi kan?
Ada masalah rupanya.
Memang ada memang ada masalah besar di kalangan muslim komunitas di sini di Melbourne saja misalnya. Jadi lagi-lagi tadi kita mau bicara manis, mau bicara belak-belakan kan begitu kan kawan saya tadi kan. Tapi pada minta saya ngomong belak-belakan kan? Iya. Nah, jadi maksud saya adalah pemerintah baik di tanah air maupun yang di sini, pemerintah baik di tanah air maupun di sini jangan kemudian menganggap ini sebuah pertarungan politik semata, gitu. Sehingga kemudian melakukan tindakan-tindakan kompromi yang membahayakan NKRI masa depan. Gitu. Nah akhirnya membuat posisi-posisi kami menjadi berhadapan dengan pihak yang radikal tadi itu, dan pada saat yang sama kemudian kita sama sekali tidak mendapat dukungan. Karena apa? Karena pemerintah merasa bahwa semuanya adalah warga kita yang harus kita rangkul. Ya toh kemudian bagaimanapun juga bisa kita manfaatkan semuanya untuk kepentingan politik 2019 dan seterusnya. Ini yang saya kira menjadi persoalan. Gitu. Dan karena itu sudah waktunya kita bersikap tegas bahwa kita tidak bisa meladeni orang-orang khawarij, bahwa kita tidak bisa meladeni orang-orang yang melakukan gerakan takfiri tadi, menganggap Islam yang paling benar. Itulah sebabnya sekarang pertarungan yang terjadi adalah di 3 level. Pertama ada di sekolah umum di Indonesia ya. Sekolah umum itu kan cuma 2 jam belajar agama. Nah, sementara penelitian-penelitian yang ada menunjukkan bahwa yang mengajar itu kualifikasinya tidak jelas, terus bahkan yang diajarnya pun juga gerakan-gerakan takfir tadi seperti itu. Itu sudah mulai masuk. Yang kedua, terus selain sekolah, yang kedua adalah masjid dengan majelis taklim. Tadi pun misalnya, ini Idul Adha, jadi selamat Idul Adha buat kawan-kawan muslim semua. Saya masih dapat laporan misalnya para khotib yang ceramah di Idul Adha tanah air itu masih bicara politik, masih ngomongin juga pilkada yang udah lewat, gitu. Yang orang yang udah di penjara gitu masih juga ngomongin juga di apa gitu. Dan ini terus menerus gitu. Karena kan ini akan bola akan menggelinding untuk 2018 pilkada berikutnya dan 2019 pilpres. Nah, perlukah ada sertifikasi untuk para khotib? Nah, ini jadi persoalan konkretnya. Banyak yang curiga dengan negara, mengatakan kalau negara ikut sertifikasi kemudian akhirnya menjadi negara mengkooptasi para khotib para apa. Tapi pada saat sama kalau itu tidak dilakukan sertifikasi, nggak jelas kualifikasinya siapa yang harus bicara. Asal bisa teriak garang terus pakai sorban, dengan kayak saya pakai belangkon gitu kan. Sorbannya cuma di sini. Nah, ini pertarungan. Pertarungan ketiga adalah medsos. Sekarang ini luar biasa. Orang nggak lagi baca koran sekarang. Anak-anak muda, termasuk anak saya pun juga udah nggak lagi mau baca buku. Yang dibaca adalah sekarang medsos gitu kan. Nah, Bu Konjen ini suka gemes sama saya kalau di medsos gitu kan. Segala macam dibahas kata gitu kan. Dari mulai sisir gitu. Nah terus juga, dan saya berantem di medsos gitu dengan orang-orang yang tadi saya bilang gerakan takfiri dan seterusnya gitu. Tapi kalau kita tidak turun gunung, kita tidak lawan itu siapa gitu yang mau meladeni itu? Karena cepat sekali, bahasa ada Saracen ya, yang baru muncul itu misalnya. Dan ini harus ada orang yang berani kemudian dimaki-maki. Tiap jam itu saya di-mention maki-maki, dicaci maki gitu ya. Kalau di Twitter dan di Facebook misalnya. Tapi itu resiko kalau kita memang mencintai Islam kita, mencintai NKRI kita gitu. Ya apa boleh buat, kita harus bertahan di sana gitu. Nah, banyak kawan-kawan saya yang juga tidak setuju dengan gerakan takfiri itu, tapi nggak mau tangannya kotor turun di medsos seperti itu gitu kan. Karena menganggap reputasinya jatuh gitu. Terus kalau sudah dicaci maki kemudian harga dirinya jatuh gitu kan. Sementara kalau saya merasakan bahwa ya memang saya nggak punya harga diri, saya nggak punya. Jadi kalau bahasanya para ulama gini Bu Konjen, merendahlah Anda sampai Anda nggak pernah bisa direndahkan lagi. Nah, jadi kalau kita sudah merendah, apa lagi direndahkan gitu kan? Mereka ngomongin di bawah titik nadir loh, saya udah titik nadir. Apa lagi? Ya, saya kira waktunya sudah habis. Terima kasih. Saya sukses malam ini menggoda Bu Konjen. Nanti kita lanjut Bu Konjen. Ya, saya kira demikian. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
The real thing is that it is a divisive power. I mean, we have problem with social harmony and social cohesion. So, would you mind that to answer our question is what we should do? I mean, to make this definition and this meaning of Islamophobia and radicalization, be it from social, psychological point of view, be it from theology point of view, to work in a community base to keep our social cohesion and social harmony. Maybe start with
I think you can come up with very sound definitions based on very sound empirical analysis of very sound evidence, and still get drowned out by the BS that's on the internet. Yeah, because there's just so much bloody BS on the internet. And that's the world that we live in at the moment. I mean, Greg probably has, much more reliable data about, who's gone to Syria and who's returned. But if the internet says something different, and it happens to be a website that's appealing to various kinds of people for the reasons that we've talked about, they're listening to Greg Barton. All right, so it is in the sense that it is, a battle of ideas, right? But it's not a battle of ideas that just because it takes place in the virtual world is completely divorced from, the real world. Okay, the thing is actually, how do you actually deal with these sorts of organizations and those who espouse these sorts of ideas, where you actually are able to constrain the influence of what they say. And with an empty head, they go to the internet with accumulation of knowledge, accumulation of experience, accumulation of anger and frustration and so on, and they go, oh, this talks to me, even though it's based on complete lies.
We scholars, we have been asked to provide evidence, right? But in fact, they don't need evidence. Those takfiri movement, they don't need evidence. So for example, when I make an argument with them in social media, then I presented more than 15 books, classic books of tafsir, Quranic exegesis, and they only have one translation. And then they don't believe me. They just follow what the translation says. Although I said that the translation is wrong, this is what the 15 classic books of Islam say like this. They do not understand about those who are Ibn Kathir, who are Imam At-Tabari. They don't get. They just said that
because it's their interest.
Yes, it's their interest, and they just follow. And then they spread this through the meme and right. So how at the same time, as the scholars, we try to provide the evidence, we try to do some empirical research. Simply didn't work.
Yeah, let me add to what Glenn is saying. I mean, I agree with your sentiments, but I disagree when you say what you're doing doesn't work. Because I suspect, I mean, we can't really measure this easily, but I suspect what you're doing makes a big difference. And I think one thing to take away from tonight is that it's true those with a takfiri attitude, that's a problem because it's incitement to hatred. But it's actually a very small number of people. The people we have to be more concerned about is the mainstream, including young people who genuinely don't know and are genuinely confused and are looking for answers. And I think for the things you post, for such people can have influence. I mean, thank goodness in Indonesia we have mass organisations like Al-Ulama and Muhammadiyah. Otherwise, the situation could be very much worse. I think it's one of the critical factors of ballast stabilising Indonesian society, and it's one of the reasons that democracy has, imperfectly continued to work. So we shouldn't give up on the mainstream. In fact, I think one of the lessons of the current era of contestation that we're in is that it's the mainstream that needs to be more confident, more assertive, graciously assertive, but more confident to speak up and more active. Because, if there's some extremist taking over the local mosque to give a very hateful sermon, it's not because that person is represented by a large group of numbers, it's just because the extremists are better organised. They approach the mosque committee, maybe they make a payment of money, maybe no one else is around, maybe there's an annual meeting and their friends along and they get the numbers in the mosque committee to get their friend elected. But they're very active, so this minority element is very active, and that's the reason they seem to have a power beyond what their numbers actually suggest. So the answer to that is for the mainstream majority to be more active and not be complacent. And I think if that happens, then whether it's Australia or Indonesia, in both cases, we can deal with this problem. But if we give up and say it's too hard, and if we get distracted by those so-called trolls on Medsos or the minority element that takes all of our energy and attention, and we forget that actually a confident mainstream message articulated well will have impact. And that's been true, it's been proven in Indonesia over these decades past, and it's proven in Australia as well. And that applies to both sides of the problem we're talking about. It applies to takfiri Islamist extremists who are inciting hatred or even violence, and it applies to Islamophobes. I mean, the average Australian, I think, if you give them a reason to unpack things, when you not infrequently have politicians or others who stand up and give a reasonable response, it actually quietens down the majority. They say, okay, that's a reasonable position, and it limits the power of those extremists, in this case, the Islamophobes. So we shouldn't be overly despairing, even though it's frustrating.
Yes, but I need to ask for the panitia. We still have time until
there is no apps like that, and then they just go to the mosque and then they complain that the Friday sermons, again, it's a hatred speech, and then even if they try to walk out, then they go to the next mosque, it's still the same. They also have to solve. Then creating an apps, there's a level field that we try to combat it. Yeah.
now he's talking.
I think an issue is that the mainstream, whether in Indonesia or the West, has turned far more to the right than it was at 10 years ago. And the reason for that is that ideas that were on the fringes before, because they have political cachet, they can mobilize people's emotions and so on, get adopted. And therefore John Howard adopted lots of Pauline Hanson's ideas. The Republican Party adopted the Tea Party's ideas. Muhammadiyah and NU. I mean, many Kiais said, oh yeah, Muslims are supposed to only elect Muslims. Right? So, even the idea of a division between mainstream and non-mainstream, that's fluid. And right now, it's turning in this direction
to the far
to the right, whether in Indonesia or elsewhere.
Okay. One of the main purposes of this discussion is to incite interactive discussion among.
Tonight, I think it's a very interesting evening. We have three speakers, two Indonesian academics, second speaker, Greg Barton, an Anglo academics. My expectation when I left home, when I look at our diverse society, which is Melbourne. But in fact, now we're talking about the two societies. Indonesian society in Indonesia, Indonesian society in Melbourne. I'm interested to ask you, Craig, similarities between radicalism in England, in Australia. Remember Parramatta shooting? Khalil, 15 years old boy, he said to his teacher, I don't feel belong to society. I think it's tragic. He was born here, educated here. The question is how to resolve this issue. Thank you.
I think first we listen to the question and then answer.
Thank you. My name is Ezra. I'm from Monash Uni. I have 3 questions. Maybe I'll mix with Bahasa Indonesia. The first one, why is Islamic radicalism intensifying in the midst of Indonesian young generation, especially in the higher education level? Second, yang kedua, ini terkait dengan Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia yang sudah disebut Profesor Barton.
You're addressing the question.
Yeah. Oke. Kita tahu dari beberapa riset terakhir, SMRC, Wahid Foundation, bahkan bertanya kepada 1.600 pengurus aktivis Rohis ya, di mana mereka mendukung kekhalifahan. Dan baru-baru ini pemerintahan Jokowi sudah banning HTI. Cuman masih ada kekhawatiran yang bisa kita lihat karena mereka pakai soft power, di mana ideologi mereka mengindoktrinasi ke semua lapisan masyarakat, khususnya yang jadi concern adalah ini adalah future Indonesian scholar. Kenapa bisa mudah sekali mereka terradikalisasi begitu? Dan juga tadi ketika Prof. Nadir Shah juga menyebut bahwa ada orang-orang dengan gerakan takfir ini bisa masuk ke sekolah-sekolah. Kenapa bisa sedemikian lagi-lagi mudahnya? Dan yang terakhir, saya seorang WNI minoritas, saya seorang Kristen. Nah, kontribusi atau peran seperti apa kalau kita bicara tentang Islamophobia ini di hadapan warga Australia ataupun sesama bangsa Indonesia yang bisa saya lakukan? Sementara Prof. Nadir Shah saja yang ilmunya sudah setinggi gunung menghadapi orang-orang kayak gini tuh, wah, sampai gemes banget. Apa yang bisa saya lakukan begitu? Setinggi langit. Saya di bawah sini. Terima kasih.
Good evening. Thank you for the discussion. It's really interesting. One of my questions is only about how is it that in Indonesia this
are you going to address the question to
everyone?
Okay.
3 of them. So how is it that in Indonesia we have this majority Muslim population, more than 80%, but they are so vulnerable and fragile into an issue that goes into attack on Islam. So it's really inside their emotion and fear. And why does it happen? And we know that this kind of discourse has been used to harvest the hatred and then goes to radicalization. So why do you think this happened? The fear of attack on Islam and creating a common enemy for them. Thank you.
All right, so the question is basically answered by Greg Barton, the first question, and then the rest everyone can answer.
Sure. The first question is nice and specific, so I can give you a fairly specific answer. We've used the word radicalisation in different kinds of ways, but we talk about young Australians, and the Islamic State has gone after school-age teenagers like 15-year-old Fahad Jabbar. That kind of radicalisation is a very specific kind of grooming and recruitment. Now, in his case, his older sister, partly because they were so much under surveillance, they were looking for somebody who wasn't under surveillance. So they chose a 15-year-old boy. And it highlights a phenomenon we've seen this last 3 years where not only are increasingly younger people being targeted for recruitment, but the recruitment occurs very quickly. So in the space of a few months. So one of the specific answers to how we deal with this problem is to educate people to be alert to signs that somebody is attempting to recruit and indoctrinate, radicalise somebody. They're sort of changing their social company, they're changing their ideas quite quickly, changing their behaviour quite quickly. So in hindsight, often we can look back and say the warning signs were there, but in this case the family, you can't blame the family because they weren't to know. But there are many other families that have seen warning signs and have spoken up, and there's been a chance to avert tragedy. So that's a very particular kind of radicalisation. It involves older people recruiting young people very, very deliberately through friendship. It's not actually that different to what happens with people peddling drugs who get young people, school kids, addicted to drugs. It's a very deliberate looking for vulnerable targets for their own purposes. And it's all about an offer of friendship, a false offer of friendship. So it can happen in many areas of life. It's teenagers and young youth are particularly vulnerable. And I mean, we're all vulnerable to the need to belong and to have friendship, but they are particularly vulnerable. The other kind of radicalisation we're talking about, I mean, why Indonesia, for example, the world's most populous Muslim majority nation, why so many people are expressing this view of being victims. That's a different kind of phenomenon. There's a connection there. There's a number of factors going on. One is all across the Muslim world, we're talking about 1.7 billion people, almost a quarter of the planet. If you look across those 50 plus nations and find how many nations have good, accountable governance, and how many have stable democracies, well, stable democracy, there's only a handful. Indonesia, Tunisia, I mean, to a lesser extent, Malaysia, which has no problems. But the whole of North Africa and the Middle East, with those exceptions, is in trouble. Turkey used to be an example, but it's slid into dictatorship. So there's a real sense of frustration and anger with being stuck with authoritarian regimes. The causes for it are complex. It had to do with the history of colonialism and the Cold War, and even the post-Cold War period. But it leaves a situation which lots of people are looking for answers and feel that they are victims. In Indonesia's case specifically, after the struggle for independence, after the declaration of the 45 constitutional independence, and then the fight against the Dutch, and then finally achieving parliamentary democracy, there was a very sensible consensus achieved. That's why the Piagam Jakarta was not included, because it was felt not only was it a problem for non-Muslims, but also for most Muslims. But then people felt left out. There was a disgruntled faction that felt they were left out. When there was the change from Sukarno to Suharto, that same faction tended to feel that had been associated with Masyumi felt that they were being left out. So they genuinely thought of themselves as victims. But it's not a healthy attitude. It may be a genuine sentiment, but it doesn't give a constructive way forward. That's why when somebody like Gus Dur says, Tuhan tidak perlu dibela, it's a much wiser and smarter way of responding. Religion is not about defending God. God doesn't need to be defended. We can be positive, we can be confident. If we see ourselves as victims, we end up being driven into the negative, dark corners. And as I said, the only answer we have really is for the mainstream community to be more confident and assertive and also creative. If I am looking for answers, for example, imagine myself as it was a few years ago since I was a young person, much like a teenager.
You're still young.
Yeah, if you say, well, what is the meaning of Sharia? What is the meaning of fiqh? What is the meaning? How do I understand this thing? And you search on the internet, you go to Google. Most of the answers you find either very extremist responses or Islamophobic responses. If you go to Amazon and just Google Islam, you will find a lot of rather prejudicial material that's Islamophobic. You won't find so much that's helpful. And there is helpful stuff out there, but finding the helpful stuff is hard. So we need to think about whether it's Medsos or whether it's the internet in general, or public life in general, going to the mosque that has something that's constructive and helpful. We need to make it easier for people to find what is really actually the mainstream positive content.
Hizbut Tahrir itu muncul itu kan sejak reformasi. Sebelumnya kita tidak mengenal, itu kan underground, kita tidak mengenal. Jadi kelompok-kelompok seperti itu justru memanfaatkan demokrasi. Karena ada kebebasan, kalau di zaman Pak Harto habis mereka. Kelar hidup lo, tapi kita kan tidak mau seperti itu. Kita kan demokrasi, sekarang kita kasih kesempatan dan seterusnya. Nah, ini yang kemudian jadi persoalan. Retorika yang dipakai itu adalah penyelundup demokrasi. Jadi begitu mereka mau dibubarkan, tiba-tiba kemudian mengatakan kami akan gugat ke Mahkamah Konstitusi. Padahal kan mereka anti demokrasi, anti Undang-Undang 45, dan sementara Mahkamah Konstitusi adalah produk dari Undang-Undang 45. Jadi memakai argumen demokrasi untuk membela diri ketika mereka tidak dibubarkan. Atau kemarin di hari ulang tahun FPI misalnya mengatakan bahwa kami merawat kebinekaan dengan menghadirkan satu pendeta misalnya. Kan jadi persoalan itu. Selama ini FPI tukang bentungin kemana-mana gitu, terus tiba-tiba mengaku membela kebinekaan. Dari mana ngebelanya gitu? Nah terus atau misalnya terakhir bahkan mbahnya hoax John Roo di TV mengatakan dia tidak pernah buat berita hoax, tidak pernah buat fitnah, gitu kan semua. Dia tidak pernah menjonru, coba bayangkan. Dia tidak pernah menjonru. Semua orang tahu data jejak digital masih ada. Jadi ini yang saya pikir mereka menggunakan bahasa-bahasa untuk melakukan penyelundupan. Mereka menggunakan bahasa demokrasi, bahasa bineka juga, terus bahasa juga bahwa mereka orang baik. Nah, ini yang kemudian kita harus bisa memilah. Nah, cuma sekarang kan orang jadi bingung seperti kata Greg tadi. Yang mana yang harus kita ikuti beritanya? Gitu. Jadi kalau Al-Quran mengatakan kalau ada berita kita harus tabayun, lalu tabayunnya kemana? Gitu kan, ini beritanya sudah kacau balau semuanya gitu. Nah, tapi kan kalau Greg ini kan selalu positif, jadi kita tidak harus pesimis, kita masih bisa memperbaiki. Ya, mudah-mudahan Bang Fedi juga positif.
Ini menurut saya sih salah satu hal yang menghambat kelompok-kelompok yang sudah established seperti Muhammadiyah atau NU untuk mengambil posisi yang lebih tegas adalah ini. Sebetulnya mereka berkompetisi dengan kelompok-kelompok ini untuk punya pengikut juga. Jadi kalau misalnya pengikut-pengikut mereka yang muda-muda itu lebih tertarik kepada pikiran-pikiran HTI, ya seperti di NU kan cemas gitu loh. Oh ini anak-anak kiai segala macam ikut HTI gitu. Dia kan basis sosial kita gitu. Jadi menjadi semacam pendorong untuk kiai-kiai juga untuk khotbah-khotbahnya supaya ya menarik juga orang-orang ini gitu. Itulah ketarik ke sebelah sini. Sama juga Muhammadiyah gitu. Ya pertama sama PKS kan ini ya, karena masjidnya mereka diambil sama PKS gitu kan kalau istilah orang Muhammadiyah. Tapi pertarungnya juga sama gitu loh. Kalau misalnya ada orang-orang dari warga Muhammadiyah yang ikut dengan kelompok-kelompok yang garis keras ini, mereka takut kehilangan basis sosial, karena basis sosial itu adalah pengaruh itu adalah memberikan mereka kemampuan untuk bernegosiasi dengan negara, untuk kedudukan, untuk resources, untuk aset. Mereka takut gitu kehilangan itu. Jadi ya banyak lah juga pimpinan-pimpinan mereka yang ngomongnya ya nggak terlalu jauh daripada Habib Rizik gitu. Terus kenapa ini orang-orang muda yang terdidik kok bisa tertarik pakai gini-ginian? Sebenarnya nggak aneh, itu bukan fenomena Indonesia, bukan fenomena. Ada penelitian di Timur Tengah yang mengatakan bahwa saya lupa jumlahnya 70% atau apa ya. Ini tapi kira-kira 10 tahun yang lalu mengatakan bahwa jihadi yang identified itu 70% have university education dan sebagian besar engineering atau yang eksakta. Menurut penelitinya alasannya adalah karena kalau di dalam eksakta itu semuanya harus jelas, 1 tambah 1 2 gitu loh. Jadi kalau misalnya ada tafsiran yang oh ini bisa ditariskan dari kiri, dari sini nggak mau itu, maunya ayat ini artinya ini udah gitu. Tapi ada lebih jauh dari itu. Saya pikir masalahnya, dan saya lihat di beberapa negara sih ya. Saya lihat ini terutama di Indonesia, di Mesir dan Turki yang saya teliti secara agak dalam, itu yang kita sebut kelas menengah gitu ya. Kalau menurut McKinsey segala, kelas menengah kita 45%. Terus terang aja kalau saya teliti secara lebih mendalam angka-angka itu yang saya lakukan beberapa waktu yang lalu, menurut saya kira-kira 70% dari 45% itu ada di batas definisi kelas menengah dia. Jadi artinya rentan ke kelas menengahannya kan. Jadi kalau ada apa-apa itu bisa naik, bisa turun gitu. Saya ketemu dengan teman-teman di Mesir yang dosen, yang insinyur segala macam. Tinggalnya di tempat tinggal yang sedikit lebih baik daripada urban poor. Selisih antara dia dengan orang yang tinggal di Heliopolis, itu daerah itu elitnya gitu ya, itu jauh beda gitu. Akibatnya apa? Mereka bisa beridentifikasi dengan nasib orang miskin. Ya, walaupun mereka kelas menengah dan terdidik, mereka beridentifikasi ke bawah.
Menengah ke bawah.
Mimpi-mimpi mereka ke atas sebetulnya. Mereka mau konsumtif, mereka mau kaya raya, mereka mau jadi berkuasa, mereka mau jadi konglomerat, tapi nggak bisa. Karena apa? Semua jaringan kekuasaan ekonomi dan politik dikuasai oleh elit kecil. Apakah itu di Indonesia, apakah itu di Mesir, ataukah itu di Turki. Ya, walaupun di Turki itu sekarang terjadi kontestasi antara ya Kemalis dengan AKP lebih terbuka sekarang ya. Tapi cenderung seperti itu. Jadi yang saya sering katakan adalah kenapa anak muda yang terdidik itu sering tertarik pada gerakan-gerakan seperti ini. Menurut saya, apakah itu di negara-negara berkembang ataupun di negara-negara maju di mana ada orang-orang yang ya sebenarnya kan tidak melarat ya, hidupnya agak ada kepastian. Ada apa alasannya? Karena menurut saya adalah yang saya sebut sebagai janji-janji modernisasi yang telah tidak dipenuhi. Ingkar janjinya modernisasi. Jadi kira-kira itu kita dari kecil kita diajar bahwa sekolah, kerja keras, jangan maju gitu loh. Tapi struktur sosial sebetulnya nggak berjalan seperti itu gitu loh. Kita lihat ada orang bodoh tapi anak orang kaya banget dia gitu loh. Bodoh. Sekali dulu SD mas saya nggak bisa 3 tambah 5 nggak ngerti. Sekarang kok bisa mas saya Iya itu jadi janji palsu dari modernitas itu. Saya kira itu apalagi juga orang-orang yang dari Timur Tengah gitu yang ada di Eropa segala, mereka juga dijanjikan kan egalite, liberté, equalite. Nggak taunya ini kalau lapangan kerja lagi sempit ya mereka yang pertama dilepas gitu kan. Jadi muncullah itu kebencian dan amarah gitu. Ya. Kalau itu pertanyaan Anda itu kenapa 88% Indonesia punya semacam mentalitas orang tertindas padahal mereka mayoritas. Ya ini yang seperti dibilang Greg, ini bisa ditelusuri ke belakang dan menurut saya ditelusuri at least kepada periode akhir dari kolonialisme di mana struktur sosial ekonomi dari Indonesia modern ini sebetulnya mulai dibangun sedemikian rupa sehingga orang yang disebut pribumi itu cenderung tersisihkan gitu ya. Jadi kalau di zaman Belanda itu kan yang perusahaan-perusahaan besar itu milik Eropa ya kan. Nah terus kalau Syarikat Islam itu kemudian menghadapi industri batik, industri macam-macam yang tadinya mereka dikuasai kemudian diambil oleh kelompok Cina. Kenapa? Didukung oleh Belanda gitu kan. Jadi ada narasi bahwa kita ini dari dulu dikucilkan terus, kita selalu dipojokkan terus gitu. Terus mereka menjadi bagian dari gerakan nasional. Kalah bersaing sama komunis, kalah bersaing dengan Soekarno. Kemudian tahun 1945 sampai 1949 tidak berhasil memasukkan Islam menjadi dasar negara gitu ya. Milisi-milisi Islam Kartosuwiryo nggak bisa masuk ke dalam TNI gitu. Jadi merasa sekali lagi, kita udah berjuang untuk kemerdekaan, kita terkucilkan juga. Ada narasi dipojokkan lagi. Zaman Orde Baru, kita bantu Orde Baru menumpas komunisme, kita menumpas PKI gitu kan. Tapi kita disingkirin juga, ya kan? Nah narasinya terus ada komando jihad segala macam gitu kan. Nah tapi sampai sebetulnya akhir 90-an di mana Soeharto pernah lagi berantem sama militer, mulai membina dukungan dari kalangan Islam. Jadi kalau dibilang ini kelompok-kelompok itu lahir dari demokrasi, sebetulnya menurut saya mereka udah lahir dari otoritarisme. Ya, mereka udah dibina di zaman otoritarisme itu, udah ada di situ. Kemudian di zaman demokrasi menemukan fungsi baru buat diri mereka sendiri, yaitu sebagai sarana untuk mengancam orangnya, enforcer ya, seperti pemuda Pancasila, dan juga sebagai alat untuk memobilisasi massa. Ya, disitulah mereka menemukan fungsinya. Nah, tapi kalau ditarik itu bukannya karena demokrasi mereka muncul, tapi di zaman Orde Baru mereka sudah dibentuk. Ya kan ini kayak Pak Swakarsa segala dibentuk untuk membela Habibie kan terhadap mahasiswa. Jadi
Bibi masih orde baru, belum reformasi.
Ya, masih orde baru. Jadi kira-kira begitu menurut saya, bisa ditarik ke belakang.
Ada satu ya, saya tambah tadi pertanyaan penting. Jadi bagaimana dengan minoritas? Kenapa? Seperti apa? Gimana gitu? Jadi kalau dulu itu kan orang tua kita ngajarkan sing waras ngalah gitu. Kalau kamu orang waras udahlah ngalah aja gitu. Terus ngapain sih itu ngeladenin tweet war gitu segala macam ya pokoknya. Terus kalau sekarang saya merasa nggak bisa lagi orang waras ngalah. Sesama orang waras, ayo ketemu bersatu kita. Nah, jadi sekarang saya selalu percaya di tiap komunitas selalu ada orang warasnya. Makanya itu saya ngajak orang-orang waras di forum masyarakat Indonesia Australia. Nah, itu kemudian kita mencoba ketemu, berkumpul, berkomunikasi. Gimana nih kita melakukan sesuatu lah untuk menjaga NKRI sama-sama. Gitu. Saya kira itu ajakan saya.
Yeah, as much as we want to continue the discussion, time is all limited. So I think we are not going to conclude again. We still have time, I believe. Oh, still have time. Okay. So you want to ask a question?
Two more questions.
Two more questions. Good point. One there, because the first and then the second.
Islam radikal ini, gerakan Islam radikal dengan para penganut atau yang sekarang sedang marak penganut bumi datar. Jadi karena begini, sekarang ini zaman begitu modern, ilmu pengetahuan terbuka, orang bisa mengakses kepada ilmu pengetahuan dengan mudahnya melalui internet. Tetapi ironisnya adalah kebanyakan orang sekarang memungkiri kenyataan. Jadi seperti yang tadi Gus Nadi bilang, saya berargumen dengan mereka menggunakan kutipan dari banyak sekali tafsir-tafsir Islam oleh ulama-ulama modern, ulama-ulama yang bagus-bagus. Mereka meng-cancel argumen saya dengan tafsir terjemahan yang kualitas terjemahannya dipertanyakan. Begitu juga dengan para penganut bumi datar. Ilmu pengetahuan dibangun ratusan tahun melalui eksperimen, teori dan seterusnya dengan berbagai pengujian yang luar biasa. Tapi kebanyakan orang sekarang dengan mudahnya mengatakan itu konspirasi NASA. Dan konon Presiden Donald Trump adalah salah satunya.
Baik, kamu mau bertanya kepada siapa?
Kepada semuanya.
Ya.
Satu lagi kepada Gus Nadir. Kalau nggak ada yang undang ceramah, IKWin akan undang Anda.
Ya.
From my observation, there are two polarizing views about the relationship between terrorism and Islam. One view says terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. This is of course the view of many governments, and especially Indonesian government. And I totally understand why they take this view, because they and we don't want the war between religion. On the other hand, there's another view which says terrorism has everything to do with Islam, since almost all, if not all, terrorists in the last 16 years claim that they are implementing the teaching of Quran. And many scholars point out that the Prophet Muhammad himself did teach and practice violence, especially during the second half of his life. What do you think of this?
Would you mind telling who is yourself and
I'm Budi Setiawan. I'm asking Professor Greg and also maybe Dr. Adil. Thank you.
Yeah, start with the question or the anyone like about the bumi datar?
Itu bumi datar itu sebetulnya julukan kalau di kalangan medsos ya, ngomong dasar kaum bumi datar itu ada beberapa kata, misalnya ada lagi bilang dasar bani taplak, cemonger, ahoker atau itu banyak istilah seperti itu. Tapi saya kira kaum bumi datar tuh nggak cuma orang Islam, banyak di kalangan agama lain pun juga yang masih percaya bahwa bumi itu datar juga ada. Tapi maksudnya istilah kaum bumi datar itu kaumnya ngeyel itu tadi. Mau dikasih bukti seperti apapun gitu pasti akan bilang oh enggak gitu. Pasti ada aja jawabannya gitu. Itu tadi kita kasih foto satelit bumi itu bulan gitu ya. Terus akan bilang itu kan konspirasi NASA. Nah, jadi ya kadang-kadang saya cuma bilang ya bumi itu mungkin kayak ini aja lah, kayak telur, kadang-kadang bisa telur ceplok, kadang-kadang bisa telur dadar. Nah, tapi poinnya saya kira adalah sekarang karena tadi tidak ada sertifikasi yang ustadz, khutbah segala macam, sekarang semua persoalan ditanyakan ke ustadz, gitu. Dari mulai soal operasi sesar gitu ya, terus kemudian dibilang bahwa itu kemasukan jin harus dirupiah, misalnya gitu kan. Ya banyak sekali soal atau misalnya kayak tadi, kalau saya ditanya bumi itu datar atau tidak menurut Al-Quran, saya bilang menurut saintis aja, gitu. Tanya ke saintis, jangan tanya ke ahli agama. Ini kan masalah sains. Tadi masalah penyakit sesar atau tidak, jangan tanya ke ustadz, tanya ke dokter, gitu kan. Nanti sekarang enggak, jadi overdosis agama, semua ditanyakan ke ustadz, dan ustadznya juga nggak tahu diri, mau menjawab semua. Karena kalau dia ngomong ke TV, saya nggak tahu, gitu. Wah nggak bisa, besok mau diundang lagi, gitu. Mendingan kayak saya kan bercandain yang pokoknya nggak mau diundang. Nah, terus soal yang tadi teroris tadi itu ya. Itu tadi kita mau bicara belak-belakan atau mau bicara manis. Kalau kita bicara manis, level diplomasi, tentu kita akan bilang, ya ini bukan masalah agama, nggak ada kaitan sama agama, gitu kan. Tapi kalau kita mau bicara belak-belakan, ISIS itu misalnya, itu jelas dia mengambil rujukan dari Quran, dari hadis. Karena saya mengatakan ini ada pertarungan internal umat Islam sendiri. Sebagaimana juga ada pertarungan internal di kalangan agama lain gitu ya. Misalnya bagaimana ARE di Irlandia itu misalnya, itu agama atau bukan misalnya. Nah jadi menurut saya memang kombinasi eksternal dan internal yang tadi kita bahas itu yang bermain di situ. Ada persoalan internal, tapi juga kita nggak usah menutup diri bahwa juga ada ketidakadilan yang luar biasa di dunia ini, yang kalau itu tidak dibenahi dan terus menerus menyalahkan kelompok agamawan, saya kira nggak fair juga. Jadi saya kira it takes two to tango. Jadi kalau kita mau berdansa ya kita harus dua-duanya gitu. Saya kira itu. Oh lagi foto.
We started discussion this evening with some definitions. Definitions are frustrating, but it is helpful to be as clear as possible about what we're talking about. So let me go back to briefly a definition of terrorism. Terrorism, as we know it, has been around since the late 19th century, so a bit over 1 century, not that long. And it's manifested in different ways. Terrorism is strictly speaking a method, but it's generally associated with a social movement as well. And the definition that's generally agreed about terrorism is that when nation states do bad things to their own people or other people, that may be war crimes or may be political crimes, but that generally put them in different categories than terrorism. Terrorism is largely about non-state actors. They can be transnational, like Islamic State, so-called, Al-Qaeda, but they're non-state actors, and they are using violence, or at least even perhaps just intimidating violence, for a purpose of bringing about change. They have a political vision. Now, politics in the broadest sense. So some terrorist movements, like, for example, the IRA, or ETA, or GAM, these were movements which were ethno-nationalist. Their political vision was to right a perceived wrong, often which has some truth to it, we understand. And so their ideology is bound up with this notion of ethnicity and national identity and a sense of justice, self-determination. In the 60s and 70s, we had a lot of left-wing groups, quite small, but quite significant. So somebody like Carlos the Jekyll, the Baader Meinhof Complex, the Red Brigade, and so on. Often they hitched themselves to the Palestinian cause as a way of justifying what they were doing, but their ideology, as much as we can understand, was a radical left position. We have seen for decades now right-wing extremist groups emerge. The dominant feature of terrorism today, though, is so-called religious terrorism. But it's mixed up with right-wing elements as well. So it depends on the context. In India, we see the rise of the Hindutva right-wing Hindu extremism. It's kind of nationalism mixed with sort of Hindu fundamentalism. Right now in Myanmar, we're seeing a lot of violence against the Rohingya. In the name not just of Burmese nationalism, also there are some prominent monks, Buddhist monks, who sort of have a fundamentalist Buddhism, as you can understand. Same thing in Thailand that justifies that violence. In Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there's a group called the Lord's Resistance Army. We don't hear about it much because it stays in Central Africa. But it says that it's led by the Holy Spirit and the Ten Commandments. It's a Christian extremist group. And in the right-wing extremism of Europe and of America, we see some elements of, some Christian ideas. It's co-opted and it's misused. If we come to a group like Islamic State, their ideology is more coherent, but of course it's a perversion. It's religion gone toxic. So if we're talking about religion going toxic, whether it's Islamic State or whether it's Aum Shinrikyo as a new religious movement in Japan, I think we can't, as we discussed earlier, we can't say it's only about, just like if somebody's in the Ku Klux Klan and they're parading around with Christian paraphernalia, we can say that's not Christian. Well, it's not Christian, it's sub-Christian. But we can't dismiss the religious connection. We have to recognize how they're using these ideas, how they're drawing a support base, and how we have to, mainstream society, respond to them.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I think that binary, is, as you say, misleading. And as Najib said, obviously, if the cultural reference points are Islamic, then it has to do something to do with Islam, right? But to say it's because of Islam is also, I think, taking a very non-contextual, very ahistoric view of the problem at hand. And I think, simply put, if it was Islam that is causing terrorism, why is it happening now? Right, and not 40 or 50 years ago. There must be things that are going on now in Islamic societies that needs explaining, and which gives you, I think, an avenue to which to understand why terrorist activities that are expressed in the form of Islamic terminology and so on come to the fore now, and not 40 or 50 years ago, right? And the other thing I think, about, the question sort of implies that these guys are irrational and backwards. I think that's a dangerous position to take. As I said, a lot of these guys are highly educated. A lot of these guys know, advanced physics and are trained in medicine and so on. They're not backward. They're not irrational. What they are is, what this is really is a particular manifestation of anger and discontent directed at the problems of modern society. So from that point of view, it's highly modern, actually. It's not backward, it's highly modern, right? In that it stems from the problems of modern society, not 7th century Arabian desert society. We're not talking about the problems of 7th century Arabian desert society. We're talking about 21st century society and its multiple complicated issues. And if we take the idea that these guys are backward, irrational, and so on, I think we start at the wrong footing. And lastly, why does a lot of this take the form of Islam in Indonesia? I think the answer is fairly simple. Look, there's lots of reasons actually to be discontented, angry, and distrustful. What frameworks do you have in Indonesia to understand this and to sort of situate yourself within society and to understand what you can do within society, right? What are they? Look, there is no left anymore in Indonesia, okay? Okay. Leftist ideas might have addressed social inequality issues in a particular way. It doesn't exist, right? Political liberalism has never really had any strength in Indonesia. Name a liberal political party in Indonesia. There is none. Social democracy doesn't exist in Indonesia. Name a social democratic party in Indonesia. There is none. So what you have really is only Islam and nationalism. And when you have the problems of modernity becoming really, really complex, grieving lots of people, what you get is Islamic fundamentalism and ultra-nationalism. And this is what is happening in Indonesia now, which I think gives us some concern for the future of our democracy. Because, this Islamic fundamentalism, radicalism, is being responded to with really ultranationalism. And both of these potentially are as authoritarian and retrogressive in terms of the development of Indonesian democracy as they are. They are as retrogressive as each other. And the problem is that if the sort of ultranationalist response gets too far, I fear that really we go back to the discourse of the new order.
All right, so to give appreciation to our speakers tonight.